welcome everyone to our second event in our Value of Place conversation series. This particular one is going to be focused on measuring and funding places to love. For those of you who I have not met, my name is Princess Ventura and I'm Regional Director for New South Wales at Urbis. Before we continue, might just get started with acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land and pay my respects to elders both past and present. Today I'm broadcasting from the Sydney CBD, which is Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. So the format today is really simple. We're gonna have two sections. The first one is gonna be focused on funding. And that's going to be a conversation that I will be moderating. Michael Stott, who is one of our design directors at Urbis, is going to come in the end and address to the panel any questions that come from the audience, any questions that you pop in that Q&A section down there on your screen. And then we will switch a bit, and Michael then is going to moderate the conversation on measurement. And similarly, I'll come in the end and address to the panel any questions that come from the audience. We really want this to be more conversational, which is why intentionally we do not have a keynote speaker today. And then that's it pretty much. And we have you for the next hour. We're gonna finish promptly at 2 o'clock. So let's just get started. Let's first introduce and welcome our panel. Let's start with Ludo Campbell-Reid, who's Director of City Design and Livability at Wyndham City Council in Victoria. We're also really fortunate to have Di Curry, who is Chief Planner at the Brisbane City Council, join us today. Greg Joblin, welcome, who's Acting Director of City Planning Infrastructure at Greater Sydney Commission. And last but not the least, Seamus McCartney, who's Head of Creative Strategy and Place Development at Lendlease. So welcome everyone. Funding, really tough time to be talking about funding. Funding, it's a really difficult environment right now, but we know that the availability of adequate, varied, and effective funding to both deliver and maintain public spaces is really crucial to us having places to love for generations to come. We know that one size does not fit all. There is no silver bullet to this. So in the next few minutes, we're hoping to have a conversation about the variety of funding mechanisms, if you will. We need to have a toolbox of different funding mechanisms so that we can go and deliver and maintain places of different shapes and sizes and for different purposes. So this afternoon, we're gonna explore some of those mechanisms that are both about delivering great places, new places, as well as maintaining them. So maybe let's start with Ludo. Ludo, can you tell us what the different mechanisms and levers are that the Wyndham City Council has to direct funding of great places?
Oh, look, thank you, Princess. Thank you, everybody, and great to be here. And thank you all for tuning in. This is a really important issue, as you just said, around, particularly at the moment. It's important even without the massive challenges we've got. So, look, I remember a great quote, vision without a budget is a hallucination. And I think it's really important that we understand how we fund things. So how do we fund great places? I mean, Wyndham City Council is no different to any other LGA in Australia, really. I mean, of course, there are differences, and of course, globally, but the difference is really in Australia is really the appetite for a particular authority to utilize different sets of tools that are actually available to itself. I see very much that on a risk continuum, that sense of moving from traditional to slightly non-traditional through to quite innovative being a journey that we're on, and particularly at Wyndham we are. And it's particularly based around risk and actually what other people, constituents, communities actually think that is the role of local authorities. So, it's really important to say that up front. The second point, I suppose, is to talk about, in the context of the discussion, the importance of the level of fiscal prudence that we're all bound to be making, affordable financial sustainability, all those sorts of things but also rate capping. I mean, Di from Brisbane will know that, or maybe it's different in Brisbane, but we've had a substantial rates capping process from the government for many years, which limits our ability to increase rates to fund great projects. So it's part of the context within which we sit. And we need to be more smarter, much more innovative, and much more risk open in terms of moving forward, because we can't just do it alone. So in terms of our journey, Princess, it's really around 3 areas. Of course, Di will know this as well, but the general rates, of course, is our traditional way through businesses and residences. City deals in Australia have picked up pace, and I think they're a great example. We've got a problem, we've got an opportunity, we need a partner, so that kind of sense of government. Borrowing, of course, we can borrow at good rates, but it's around spreading that burden over generations of people rather than of the immediate, so future and current ratepayers. Grants from federal and state as well have come in. The one I was going to add into this is DCs, of course, but actually I think that's worth a conversation at some point, but they're actually a debt. They're not revenue, as a lot of people think they are. They're actually induce more infrastructure costs on an organisation, on a council, and commits you to future spending, which we may not have. So they work in greenfield areas in some respects, but they commit you to future projects and infrastructure that we don't have the money. So they're not really a revenue generation tool. The non-traditional pieces are obviously the public-private partnerships, the special charges. In Australia, you have the ability to levy special rates and targeted rates, value capture deals, and also naming rights, so things which are slightly more traditional but non-traditional. In Wyndham, we have an A-League stadium football project which is underway. It's a value capture deal in some respects. It's also a PPP, and it's also a naming rights. So we've used the bundle of things. You were right earlier, it's about the toolkit and using the right bits. We have the land, the commercial, the partner knows the commerce, they've got the dollars, in terms of that know-how. We've committed to a joint master plan, we've agreed returns, and there's a benefit to council around the things that we probably couldn't pay for or get in normal situation. So we get public benefit out of that. So special charges, just before I finish, is something which we can apply to projects, to places across our cities, but they usually for very particular purposes and often for marketing and events in Australia. In Auckland, actually, I had a $22 million a year budget, which was a targeted rate on businesses in Auckland, in the downtown area, which ended up being $220 million over 10 years, which was for capital projects, physical streetscape upgrades, shared spaces. All that transformation in downtown Auckland was primarily paid for by the business rates. So we can talk about that in future, but it was a very powerful tool. And then in terms of new ideas, well, actually in Auckland, they released some green bonds, which was a really new way to invest on the stock market, special purpose vehicles, URAs. At the end of the day, local authorities are not going to be able to fund everything that they need and everything that the community wants in the way that we currently do it. We're going to have to be more creative, much more embracive of the non kind of traditional tools. So that's a bit of context for the wider conversation. So I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Ludo. I think that gives us a fantastic foundation in terms of what the different levers are available to local government, really, at least in Wyndham, on how we can fund great places. Because I think often people only think about development contributions as councils,
Absolutely,
the avenue to fund great places. We might then try and get a more state government perspective. So in Sydney, Great Commission is looking at collaboration areas, and we know that you're very much looking at a very place-based approach to these collaboration areas. Greg, can you just talk to us a little bit about what the GSC is doing to influence, in a sense, state and local government to prioritize funding and improve place outcomes for these collaboration areas?
Yeah, sure. I think at the Commission, we recognise that no single agency or layer of government can actually deliver great places alone. It's a collective approach. So I think from the Commission's point of view, our role is really to bring all those players to the table. So we bring together, local councils, the New South Wales government agencies, Australian government agencies, as well as all the industry partners and the development industry as well. And I think that collective approach is really important to unlock places and realise their full potential. So for each of the collaboration areas, all those partners come together and they develop a place strategy. And it's really a 20-year shared vision that identifies, the opportunities, the priorities, the actions, and any impediments as well to delivering that place. And from the governance point of view, from the Commission, we have a statutory committee, which is our Infrastructure Delivery Committee. And on that committee, we've got the Greater Sydney Commissioners, but also the Secretaries of Premier and Cabinet, Department of Planning, Industry, Environment, Treasury, Transport, Health and Education also sit on that as well. So we were able to provide, I guess, that statutory mechanism to implement those place strategies as well, in terms of looking at that 20-year period, unlocking any funding that is needed to deliver on those actions and those place strategies as well. And I guess the other thing for us at the Commission is the work that we're doing currently on place-based infrastructure compacts, which similar to the collaboration areas where we bring together all the, particularly the state government partners. We look at place outcomes from the offset. What are we trying to achieve? What are the place outcomes that we're looking at over a 20-year period? And then really looking at what infrastructure and services are needed to deliver on those great places as well, and what funding sources and how that could be delivered across government as well.
Great. And part of that collaboration, we're hearing, Greg, about partnering with different local councils as well as different layers of government, different agencies. What about partnering with the private sector? Is that something that is in the horizon?
Yeah, I think so. I think from our point of view, there is already state government agencies out there as well that are looking at unlocking great places. Place like Lancom and even Sydney Metro, they have that placemaking function as well. So it's really across all of government, but also the industry as well. And in terms of the collaboration areas, industry are very much in the tent, particularly some of the ones that are based on health and education precincts. We have the universities, we have hospitals, we have industry partners in there as well, which are really key to delivering those place outcomes.
Great. And Seamus, we might lean on you for the developer private sector perspective. Hearing what Greg is saying, firstly, any views or comments, reactions that come to mind when you hear about what Greg is talking about in terms of what GSC is doing? And then the second part of that question is, any views on how the planning system can incentivize, better place outcomes for our cities?
I think firstly, hello, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. And I should say first, for us, places are not just public domain. And I think that's really important in this conversation. For Lend-Lease, that's from the lobby all the way through to the wharf at Barangaroo or kitchen to curb at Brisbane Showgrounds. And therefore, there's a collision of public good and commercial or private good that needs to be interfaced to make places really work. I can't get past the word Greg said about collective approach. That, in my experience, anywhere around the world where we've been able to have a collective approach and look at an appropriate allocation of risk and reward as well, we've seen great places come. Elephant Park in London was a really challenging development with Southwark Council over there, but risk and reward was there to be able to do things. I'd also point to Barangaroo in Sydney, where I think the BDA, the Barangaroo Development Authority, has made Lend-Lease deliver a better development. And there's quite a saying in our business around we do better work when we're working in collective arrangements with partners to deliver better outcomes, and that our investors and funders win, which of course is the whole point of this discussion. So, to answer your second question around planning schemes, it's interesting to see how COVID has made us speed up the planning system, and I think some of us would think that's a good thing, but I also think there's reasons planning systems are in place for checks and balances as well, so we need to be careful that's not overshot. But what I look to, and I'm based in Sydney at the moment, so I'm going to talk about New South Wales government. Pre-COVID was doing great early stage investigations into planning outcomes for projects such as Central Station, which is pre-sounding well up front to start establish both with transport, public industry, and all the regions that sit around it to come up with a plan to deliver, I think, a lot of the things Greg's talking about cross-functional outcomes from university sectors, creative sectors, all the way through to transport. Look, I think ownership is a real key one here for us. And as a developer of scale, we love scale because it means we can invest up front and then get a reward down the back end. So not having precincts which are broken up into smaller areas and that we can take a long-term view in and incubate different outcomes is a really attractive thing for us to be able to weigh into the funding of great places. And I point to mind in Milan, our big innovation district, which is a very large 60-hectare development where we're working in partnership with the City of Milan. And we're able to invest in many different ways there and bring funding in many different allocations to be able to deliver place. We've even got infrastructure funds there, which are a totally new class of investment to allow us to be able to deliver that infrastructure in place earlier than we otherwise would be in a normal development solution.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So scale is really important, and I would imagine coordination as well in terms of investment in place outcomes. It is really important. And I like what you said, Seamus, about that. You know, when we talk about place, it's not just about public spaces or parks. It's really everything in the built form environment that people really move through. And some of that space can be private and some can be public. Di, we might turn to you to ask you any ideas and thoughts on how can we improve alignment and coordination to improve the effectiveness of funding of great places, regardless of who spends it, whether it's government or private sector.
You're on mute, Di.
Mute.
What's the rule? We've got to do 5 of those in every Zoom meeting. It had to be me today.
Yeah.
Thank you for the invitation. I was reflecting, thinking through as Greg and Seamus were speaking in particular, but I know it's a principle that Ludo believes in as well. For me, the funding dollars are so difficult and limited these days, no matter whether you're government or private sector. The critical thing for me is being really careful with that money. So really focused principles about the high quality design. What's the purpose of the space, whether it's a park, whether it's a big park, a little park, whether it's public space or private. It's being really clear and all agreeing on what that space is for, and then making sure we're designing it well for that space and able to maintain it or activate it in an ongoing basis well, and that we all know about that and settle on that from the beginning. Because I just don't think we have the time or money anymore to not get those things right from the beginning. As a council, we do, obviously we do a lot of space. We are in the parks and open space area a lot. But my team, who also incorporate Design Brisbane as a design team, do a lot of work in what we call village precinct projects. So renovations of smaller suburban centre areas. And to do those really well is so important across the suburbs of Brisbane. So we're really clear there about what is the functionality that's needed. What is it that the community need and want from these projects, involving the community, making sure we know what we're doing, making sure we've sorted out the accessibility, the shade, the safety, the legibility of spaces, and how we can work with those businesses for that complementarity of use. And I think in terms of that focus on the high quality of design principles that we need, we've also seen the New South Wales government yesterday issue a new design guide for greener places. It's thinking through and collectively agreeing on what we all think of are those standards of design.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you there, Di, on looking at really the outcomes, starting with the outcomes, and then designing to that. We kind of have a conversation of funding without talking about development contributions. Greg, a perspective on how can we improve the place outcomes from development contributions?
Yeah, I think just maybe a bit of context from the Sydney perspective. Some of the work that we've been doing at the Commission, piloting a Place Infrastructure Compact, or a PIC as we call it. We looked at sort of the full range of infrastructure that would be required to grow Greater Parramatta to the Lingford Peninsula, for those that know Sydney. And out of the sort of the $20 to $30 billion of capital infrastructure costs that were apportioned to grow this area, about 50% of that would be needed to be funded by the New South Wales government, and only about 11% was actually apportioned to developer contributions, with about 26%, I guess, a combination of probably New South Wales government funding and developer contributions. So I think we recognise that contributions revenue can only partially fund key pieces of infrastructure, and coordination of government agencies and utilities is really needed to deliver the infrastructure and services needed to grow a place and have the services there at the right time as well. So I think we need to look at all of the funding mechanisms and make sure that we prioritise infrastructure provision to deliver those place outcomes. So we should be looking at it through, I guess, the lens of greatest benefit, and that's livability, productivity and sustainability benefits as well. And that work that we were doing on Greater Parramatta has been paired with a place-based business case as well. So out of all that, $20 to $30 billion, about 100 priority infrastructure proposals were identified across all these different sectors of government over the next 5 and 10 years. So it's really about prioritising, because we know that we can't fund the whole lot, but it's about getting best bang for our buck, I guess. And I'm really encouraged actually to see some of the work that's coming out of the infrastructure contributions reform work from the Productivity Commission and Department of Planning here, that really focuses on place outcomes as a key theme of those reforms as well.
Excellent. I mean, that's really encouraging, and that's really consistent with the Greater Sydney Commission's journey in terms of empirical evidence and evidence-based planning and best bang for your buck. I'm an economist. Yeah. That's music to my ears. As you with these events, when a topic is really interesting, you quickly run out of time. So I just want to indulge me if I can talk about business improvement districts for a second, but we will limit people to no more than a minute in terms of your comments on this. Business improvement districts is one of these tools that we've heard a lot about, used in a number of cities around the world, whether it be San Francisco, Auckland, even places like Cape Town in South Africa. They've used this, where there's a certain tax is levied on either businesses or customers. And that fund then is used to improve the maintenance and evolution of places, or even the marketing and safety of places, such as what they've done in Cape Town. So Ludo, we hear, has a lot of experience in this in Auckland, he mentioned earlier. 1 minute comment, Ludo, on, can you see a business improvement district? Can you see that working in Australia? And if so, where do you think would be the easiest?
Well, yes, and everywhere. I say that. Look, it's in my experience, I'm not an expert in bids. I just had experience of working with, alongside, and around them. But there are many examples, and I think it goes back to the comments the teams have made today. There's no one size fits all with this stuff. Cities are never binary, left and right. It's a multitude of a lot of grey in the middle. But there's some great examples, and I think it's really important for Australia to have a look at best practice out there, from Joburg through to Times Square in NYC, the Waterloo and Piccadilly Circus in London. There's lots of good examples. In the UK, we had 430 bids. It was a program that started in the 90s by the Labour government. Funding was given to set up 5 pilots in London, and as I said, now there's 430 across the UK. So they're like URAs. They're very useful for doing certain things, working in partnership with the private sector, and I think they also are very good from a reliable funding sort of source. But there's no clear sort of blueprint, and so you've got to be really clear about what's the problem you're trying to solve with a bid. It could be about urban regeneration. It could be about urban realm. It could be about maintenance, often doing things that the private sector think the public sector aren't doing well. So I think there's some good examples around the world, and I think that you could do well for the team to really do a bit of work around best practice. But the key thing for me is business trust, and I guess, you know, with bids, you need a license to operate. You have to build that partnership, and they are brilliant tools for doing so. And also learning lessons from failures is really important to understand so you can improve. My experience just in Auckland, I was able to accrue $22 million a year through a targeted rate, but it wasn't a bid or a business improvement district. It was a different sort of improvement program. And that was able to be over $220 million over 10 years. You could borrow on that, you could defer or accrue money from one year to the next. But the critical part of it, it was business money. So that when you did the projects, it was their projects. It wasn't the public doing projects to the people or the business sector. It was the private sector working with the council to build better places for people, and then making sure we have clear KPIs around the improvements and the qualities. So it was a really exciting program, and definitely one that I think the legislation is here in Australia. It goes back to my point earlier around this risk continuum, traditional thinking through to completely out there thinking. And it's about the journey that councils and government and private sector take together on that journey. So, I mean, that's as quick as I can say it in a minute.
Thanks, Udo. Seamus, turning to you, maybe but you can do it in a minute. I'm sure you can. You're from the private sector, so time is money. Can you
working hard, Princess, but anyway.
Can you think about in Sydney, where an instrument like that could be effective?
Well, I'm going to go a different way. I think we need to think about what private funding mechanisms now are looking for. And actually, they're looking for a longer term return on their investments. And the business improvement district is similar to a very small contribution from an owner, a fund, to be able to make sure their place is increasing the value of their asset over time. So we're seeing a collision of what the funding businesses around the world, the big funds, property trusts, and what we want as developers and cities are becoming more aligned. It's just how we actually do that. My question for everyone is around COVID and its impact on regional cities, which we think is a boom, obviously, as part of the disaggregation of work, if that happens, and how these tools could be used. Ludo, you mentioned you're living in Geelong, which is an extraordinary town. Wollongong, Newcastle, there's a list a mile long of great towns that could do with these sort of approaches to be able to pick up the capacity of those to be able to service the economy, which is going to be one of our biggest challenges coming out of here.
Thank you for and then turn to Michael to take up questions that are coming. I can see there's quite a number of them. I haven't opened them, but there's like 8 of them in there. So I'm sure Michael will do his best to summarize that. So I think it's a good topic on funding to end with, if you can give us a perspective on how do we keep stakeholders invested for the long term? How do we make sure that we maintain and make sure the places that we create evolve and remain relevant to the community for years to come?
Princess, we've lost you a bit there in terms of quality. You've crackled away merrily, but I think I got it. Look, for me, I think one of the things we have to do is be really careful about always adapting to new circumstances and changing people and changing needs. And I think that if nothing else, the last 6 months has shown us the importance of public space to the public. People have wanted, loved and adored being out in their parks safely more than they have in a long time. One of the things we do is try and run different programs in our spaces, helping people get out and see them and explore them in a different way. So the example in my head at the moment is Botanica, which was a temporary art installation festival in our Botanic Gardens. Day and night events, so people coming for different reasons to explore the spaces in a way that maybe they don't think of normally, and also at different times of the day. So trying to keep things fresh and keep relevant to the community.
And we'll turn to Michael for questions from the floor.
Can I say it again, Princess?
Sorry, I'm in the office, so there shouldn't be any reason why the technology.
You're back now, Princess. It's working.
Thank you. Michael, can we turn to you to attempt to summarize the numerous questions that are coming from the audience?
Yeah. There's quite a few, and realizing the importance of time. I think some of them have been answered through actually Ludo's answer to your question, which was about from Yan Ling about how is when the funding is collected, where and how is it decided where it's spent, and various things. And I think Ludo, you alluded to that as well. And I think perhaps maybe one of the more interesting questions, if we just have a short one, I'll direct to Seamus perhaps. There's a good question here from Louise about a triple bottom line approach to not only projects but placemaking. And so maybe from Lend-Lease's point of view, you could just very quickly talk about how, you know, what Lend-Lease's, what your approach is to that triple bottom line of valuing placemaking.
Yep. Look, and we announced about 6 months ago that we had created a tool called the Better Places Index, which is really our framework around how we make decisions in conjunction with stakeholders, customers, and commerciality of projects. So those things all work in hand on how we would direct decisions around projects. And I'm going to put my hand up. Place for me is just good urban development. I don't think it's any different to, it's not a different subset than anything else. So we use that to help us not only look at what we think is the right solution, but we bring consumers or customers and experts in to triangulate that data, because often we have a view which may not be the same as the community's view or may not be the same as the stakeholders' view. And I know there's a few questions around that as well. So we see that as important. What it also tells us is what not to invest in. And I think that's a really important decision. We spoke about it in the last Urbis panel we did around this. It's just important about what you don't do than you do. And, you know, I think Di, you know, you haven't given yourself credit enough in Brisbane in changing golf courses to open space is a very timely move, you know, and gives the power of a bigger council's ability to be able to make those decisions. So we use the BPI to help us not only set our strategic direction, but then measure our decisions and changes along the way of our generational projects, because having a $120 billion pipeline and projects to go for 20 or 30 years, things change. So being able to direct those. What that also is going to give us over time is data, and data around the impact of decisions that we make, not just data for the sake of data. And it's actually that link to, we made a call, we did something that's actually very important for us.
No, that's great. And a good segue into what we were hoping to talk about in this second portion of our discussion today about not just creating pretty places, but actually measuring place. And a lot of people on the call will appreciate that how we measure the success of placemaking has changed and has been constantly changing for the last several decades. 20 years ago, we measured it based on footfall and a lot of public opinion surveys. And then a decade ago, we started shifting into more technical and economically focused tools. And then more recently, as is evidenced even with Ludo's new position in Wyndham, is we've turned to more how do we assess social value, which I think makes it more interesting. So we've seen this progression towards a suite of tools to measure the value of place, but the constant complication that we find is that place means different things to different people at different times. And so maybe as we can build on some of the conversations in part one, we'll continue the discussion by first maybe flipping to you, Di, just to ask quickly, and Ludo chime in here if you have something to say, and Greg as well, is what is in our context the municipality's role in shaping the discussion around value in placemaking?
Look, I think it's critical for us. We do it both in our own projects, but also being conscious of what that means to the community. So in our own work, we do surveys before and after projects, surveys that are based, they're a place-based survey that were inspired by Ethan and PPS. we look at what's important to the community, but also then coming back to those principles of really good design for us, but also business viability. So we look at tenancy levels, has turnover improved in that area? And then one of the things we automatically do now is an activation exercise to bring people in, just to lift up that experience and get people to know their new place or their refreshed place. But I'd just like to pick up on that scale you were just talking about, Michael. For me, the other concept is, as you were saying as well, Seamus, everybody has a different definition of what place is. And I think in terms of creating great places, we should also think about that on a suburban city scale. Brisbane City Council did an amazing community engagement exercise a couple of years ago, 18 months ago now, that we finished, that involved 277,000 interactions with the public, so huge results. And one of the really, really significant responses that was received time and time again was the importance of good design and how strongly the public react to their perception of bad design. That resulted in the creation of Design Brisbane, a design strategy for the city, and ongoing work. So I think we need to be really thinking through, as professionals in this space, the importance of design, the importance of place at every possible scale.
Yeah, so maybe I'll throw that to Ludo as well in a different way, which is more perhaps asking the question that how do we measure the success of place when it's compared to surrounding neighbourhoods or a citywide economy, given your current remit. There's value obviously at the micro scale, but that scales up as the context changes and the value proposition changes as well. So how's Wyndham dealing with that?
Thanks, Michael. It's really fascinating to listen to Di talking about the work that's happening in Brisbane as well. This is a conversation, a fascinating one, really around the kind of quantitative and qualitative aspects of what we do. You know, that idea of you only measure what you value, and there was a great quote by, I think, Vice President Joe Biden said, you know, don't tell me what you value, show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value. You know, it's really important that we realize that GDP is not a good use or a good kind of determinant of well-being and livability. And so in Wyndham, which is really interesting, their kind of key determinant is to become one of the world's most livable cities, and currently it is not. And so what we have is developed as a livability, a measure. We measure livability, and we report that annually through the annual plan, the council plan, and also our annual report. And we measure a range of non-financial kind of criteria based on other things. We measure people and community, the focus on factors that impact physical and mental health. We look at excessive weight issues, anxiety, depression, as all part of exposure to crime, are all part of the measures of the people. Then there's people and places, factors that create healthy physical environments, having access to housing, transport, all those sorts of reduced carbon emissions, earning and learning, monitoring access to employment, levels of engagement in education, and leadership and participation, I suppose, is really measuring attitudes to multiculturalism, volunteerism. So we've got a really interesting program which starts to measure things against those non-financial. And I suppose what's good is what we would like to do now is move that into when you're preparing a business case, is to make sure you have the finances, like Di was saying, as well alongside these non-financial combination of the things. It's the sum of the parts, right, rather than the single thing. So that's really what we're doing, and there's many examples around the world. Even the Jacinda Ardern government in New Zealand has got a well-being budget. So, you know, it's changing. The world is changing. They're realizing there are other ways to measure well-being than just GDP.
No, that's great, and leads into a question for Greg. So what then, in your experience and what you're currently doing now in Sydney, what role then does these kind of measurements that Ludo was talking about in kind of some of the discussion here, what does that play, what role does that play in getting funding to invest in placemaking or to prioritize placemaking as an outcome for you guys?
Yeah, I think for us, I mean, it's all about what the others have said in terms of, you know, setting those outcomes from the start, and then making sure that there's buy-in from all levels across government, across local government, across the community, and the development industry as well. Because if we don't have that buy-in, and we can't measure success, I guess, as well at the start, you know, it's hard to get that funding. So I think it's critical for us in Sydney at the moment, you know, to make sure that, you know, every dollar is going to create, you know, a place and an outcome, and a lot of it is really around creating jobs in Sydney at the moment. I guess that's a key in terms of, you know, a stimulus from the whole impact of COVID-19. It's about there's infrastructure projects as well around, you know, creating jobs. So I think, yeah, those sort of interventions that the government and also the private industry can play are critical.
And do you think, Greg, particularly because of your kind of broad geography, in areas of fragmented ownership, how important is placemaking as the means to bring things together?
Yeah, I think it's critical. We've seen some examples in Sydney, especially in the greenfield fragmented lands, where, you know, the government has rezoned areas. They've put in a train station. I think Leppington is a prime example for those that know Sydney. You know, there's a rezoning, the train station was put in, but because the fragmented land and lack of coordination, I guess nothing has really happened there in the last sort of 5 years or so. And then you go, you know, 2 k's down the road where we've got a large developer who's got a consolidated land, who, you know, they've developed a thriving suburb there without that transport infrastructure. So I think there is definitely a place for intervention through, you know, local state government and in the industry, and through, you know, sort of public-private partnerships to actually deliver there. And I think, you know, development agencies such as Landcom in Sydney definitely have a role to play in terms of, you know, delivering the enabling infrastructure to get those places started and get them developing.
So then maybe we'll end, Princess, on a final question for Seamus, which is the same question, because I think it's also important to understand from the other side of the table, in areas of fragmented ownership, how important are specific placemaking interventions from a developer's point of view?
Well, I think if we could look at the mother of all placemaking interventions, Postcode 3000 in Melbourne started in the 1990s, and the impact that's had on that city, massive fragmented ownership, and delivered what is probably the economic engine room based around education, which is a slight problem at the moment, but has created a great city. So you then look at New South Wales and the development of the western edge of Sydney, which has been a decade-long program driven by NSW and the government with fragmented ownership, that you can now see a vibrant hub. And one of the key markers for industry maybe is looking at Darling Square's office used to be, the building we developed there was given rents classed to being on a city edge periphery. Fast forward 5 years, it's now central city. That makes a huge differential in valuation, but also then rateable numbers that then can contribute back into the society as well. So there's some key elements there. Look, we all know that if there's a plan which is logical and deals with qualitative elements, and I think that's what Di and Ludo are talking about, not quantitative financial elements, but good design being a qualitative outcome. Ludo listed, I counted 23, but I'm sure there's even different qualitative life elements that people are looking for, that we create better places. And out of that, from a purely commercial, private-led development thing, and that's not all that we think about, but that makes better assets and better economies. And Di, believe exactly what you said about that good design makes money in the long term, and we all know that as well. So the instances we're seeing in Brisbane in being able to do those sort of things around the city are certainly adding a driver to what we're looking at Brisbane Showgrounds as well, in King Street, and all the sort of elements that are around there as well.
That's great. So maybe I'll turn it over to you, Princess, to run through a couple of questions as we have time left for.
Great, thank you. There's quite a variety of questions. One that's an interesting one is whether anyone has used social media to track outcomes related to place. Ludo?
Just really quickly, I mean, we are starting to. We've actually been talking to Lucinda, who you guys will probably know from neighbourlytics, who set up a new company to, I suppose, trawl social media and get a really clear sense of data around what people are actually saying on that platform. It's not the only platform, but again, we have so many layers to community consultation. And we have technology now which allows us to find information and influence and ideas from the community that could never even have been involved with the traditional stand in front of an audience with 500 people and kind of not really integrate. So there's a real opportunity to use social media to really garner and glean real life, real time information. So we're going to be looking at working with Lucinda and her team in Wyndham. We've installed a few parklets and we're looking at working out, we've taken a few car park spaces out and we're going to look at looking at what the social media is saying. But that's not the only thing you have to look at. You have to do everything, but it's a lot more complex these days because we have the technology to make it more complex.
And any comments from the rest of the panelists on programming? How important is that? That often there's a comment that often most of the funds is spent on design, that there may not be funds left on activation and programming. How important is that?
I'll jump in quickly, and I think Di talked about the daytime, nighttime programming at Brisbane, Melbourne and Sydney. I actually think Australian cities do an exceptional job of programming, and it's down to how we can connect with private industry and local government to be able to do that tactical grassroots parklet sort of activation that may enhance different areas. Ludo was talking about before we opened up to everyone around how, you know, Paris has got 1,000 kilometres of cycleways have been introduced for COVID, but we've not really had many more delivered in Australia. So there's something there that could help us as cities be able to increase our programming and usage of public space.
Comment either from Greg or Di on how do we ensure that outcomes are heterogeneous when we deliver places that are of scale. There's a concern that the outcomes that we get start to be homogeneous. They start to look like each other. How do we make sure that the outcomes are heterogeneous?
Well, then I think you have, that's what, sorry, Greg, I just stepped straight in there, but that's where I think you have to really be clear about what are the values of that particular place. We want these places to be special and different. That's why we all enjoy traveling, whether it's around this country or any other one, to find what is truly local and authentic. So that's crucial in terms of how we design and create, I think. Sorry, Greg, over to you.
Yeah, it's really important, I think, especially for us working in Western Sydney at the moment. We're working across 9 local government areas, so 9 councils, and bringing those councils together. You know, they've all got their own strengths and opportunities, and they're all got their own outcomes that they're looking to achieve as well. So I think it's not just, you know, dropping it from one area of Sydney into another and just saying, here's the outcomes that we're looking at. We need to actually sit down with all those stakeholders and say, okay, looking at this from a place perspective over the next 20 and 40 years, what are we actually looking to achieve here?
So it's a process perhaps before we even start designing space. There's a follow-up question on nighttime economy, which is how can we develop the nighttime economy in precincts without sacrificing daytime activation?
Oh, look, I'm going to go to Melbourne as you know, probably the answer to this. Vibrant daytime economy, vibrant nighttime economy. Look, there's a real shift in Australia from Eurocentric cities to Asian cities, and they have a different tempo to them than Euro cities, and we need to acknowledge that in how we plan our cities. But it's certainly, I can't really see how there is a handbrake put on either with proper planning and infrastructure to be able to deliver them. I would say, as a test in Sydney, Vivid has got so large, well, maybe not anymore, that had started to affect the daytime usage of the city because of the temporary setup that was required to have that festival operating. So there are challenges in how that works, but probably not a long-term perspective from mine.
Thank you. And look, we can just go on like this the entire day, I'm sure, on such a phenomenal panel and on such an interesting topic as measuring and funding place. Want to start by thanking our fabulous panel here this afternoon. Greg, Di, Ludo, Seamus, thank you for joining us today and being very generous with your time and your thoughts today. Michael, thank you for co-hosting today's event. And before we end, just a reminder that we have a third event in this series, which is scheduled for September 2nd at the same time, 1 to 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That third event is going to be very much focused on authenticity and localization. That's going to be hosted by one of our directors of Heritage, Jonathan Bryant, as well as our director for stakeholder engagement, Diane Knott. And that's going to look at what the role of Heritage as well as stakeholder engagement in ensuring that we deliver places that are authentic, that feel authentic, that tell the story of our history, but also resonate with the current and the future local community. So I think with 5 minutes more to spare, we might close in there and thank everybody for joining us today and hope a number of you can join us again for our September 2nd event. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.